They slid the papers across the table as if they were passing the salt. No warning. No explanation. Just a stack of loan documents with my name already typed neatly in bold. Imagine your own parents stealing your name for $200,000. Would you scream? Or would you wait in silence for the perfect revenge? Watch this story till the end. Every second will leave you breathless. I remember the way the clock on the wall ticked, loud and steady, marking each second of my silence. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt coffee, the kind my mother reheated 3 times in the microwave. It was just after 7 on a Tuesday evening, autumn light fading outside the window, and the air was heavy with the sound of betrayal. "Sign here," my father said, tapping the line with his thick finger. His voice carried no hesitation, only expectation. I didn't scream. I didn't ask why. I simply folded my hands in my lap, watching them both with a stillness they mistook for surrender. Inside, though, my mind was already taking notes. Every detail, every word, every careless flicker of greed across their faces. My mother's smile was the kind she wore for church potlucks, rehearsed and polished, but tonight it was different. It had a sharpness, an edge of victory, as if she had already won something. "It's not just for us," she said sweetly. "This is for the family. For our future. Our future." She said it as though my life belonged to her, as though my signature was a tool she could borrow and return whenever it suited her. I lowered my eyes to the paper. The number glared up at me, $200,000. A sum so big it almost didn't feel real. My breath caught in my chest, but I exhaled slowly through my nose, steadying myself. "You don't have to look so serious," my father chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. "It's just business. We've got this handled." Handled. That was the word he always used when he wanted me quiet. The house was quiet except for the clock and the scratching of my father's pen as he signed his part. Outside, I could hear a dog barking down the street, the faint hum of a neighbor's television drifting through an open window. Ordinary sounds. Yet in that moment, everything felt sharpened, almost cinematic, as though the world had narrowed its focus to the betrayal in front of me. I noticed small things. The way my mother's hand trembled slightly as she held the paper, the way my father avoided my eyes as he flipped through the pages. They weren't confident. They were desperate. That was the first clue. The second clue sat quietly in my pocket, a small black notebook I had been keeping for months. They didn't know I had it, or that inside were dates, times, overheard conversations, and receipts I had slipped away when no one was watching. At the time it was just instinct, the way a woman keeps recipes or phone numbers written down. But now, staring at those loan papers, I knew it was going to be something much more. "Think of it like planting a seed," my mother said, her voice lilting as though she were coaxing a child. "It will grow into something wonderful and we'll all share the harvest." The harvest. I wanted to laugh. Instead, I lifted my chin and looked her straight in the eye. "Whose seed is it?" I asked softly. He faltered just for a second. A small crack in her rehearsed performance. But then my father cut in sharp as a blade. "Don't be difficult. Just sign." I reached for the pen. My hand was steady, too steady. They took it as obedience. But really it was something else entirely. As I touched the pen to the paper, my mind drifted, not away from the moment but deeper into it. I remembered years earlier when I was 16 and they borrowed my savings for a used car they claimed was for errands. I remembered being 25 when they moved into my apartment, just for a few months, and left me with unpaid bills after they left. This was not new. This was the climax of something they had been rehearsing for years. The only difference now was scale. And for the first time I wasn't the naive daughter they thought I still was. I looked up at them again, meeting their eyes one by one. My mother's smug smile, my father's impatient frown. Neither of them noticed the way I held the pen just above the line, never touching it down. "You really think this is best for me?" I asked. "For us," my mother corrected quickly. "For the family," my father echoed. Their voices overlapped, rehearsed like a script. The kitchen light buzzed faintly above us. A bulb about to burn out. My stomach tightened, but not with fear. With something else. I set the pen down. Fully. Deliberately. And I pushed the papers back across the table. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes narrowed. For the first time that evening, the room filled with silence heavier than the ticking clock. "Don't play games," my father said finally, his tone low and dangerous. I smiled just slightly. "I'm not." And that was the truth. The moment stretched. My mother reached forward, pulling the papers back to her side, her fingers pressing the edges as though she feared they might blow away. "You'll sign," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper now. "You don't really have a choice." I tilted my head, studying her. There it was again, that trembling in her hands. Fear disguised as authority. Desperation hidden under the mask of control. "You think so?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just looked at my father as though handing the problem to him. He leaned forward then, his breath carrying the faint smell of stale tobacco. His eyes bore into mine, unblinking. "You're our daughter," he said. "This is your duty." I kept my gaze locked on his, letting the silence answer for me. Because what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had already made my choice. Long before tonight. Long before these papers ever touched the table. The notebook in my pocket pressed against my thigh, heavy and steady. My secret advantage. I finally stood, pushing my chair back against the linoleum floor. The sound screeched in the silence, sharp as a warning. Both of them looked up at me, startled. "I'll think about it," I said calmly. It was a simple sentence, but it landed between us like a stone dropped into deep water. My father's mouth opened as if to argue, but my mother touched his arm, stopping him. They didn't want me walking away angry. They wanted me trapped, compliant. They thought giving me time to think would work in their favor. They didn't realize they had just given me space to plan. I turned toward the kitchen doorway, pausing just long enough to look back. My father sat stiffly, his knuckles white around his pen. My mother's smile had vanished, replaced by a tight, worried line. For the first time they looked unsure. "I'll give you my answer soon," I said. And then I walked out, the ticking of the clock chasing me down the hall. But I didn't go to my room. Not yet. Instead I slipped out the back door into the cool night air. The leaves crunched under my shoes as I stepped onto the porch, breathing in the crisp smell of autumn. Across the street the neighbor's porch light flicked on, and I saw Mrs. Larkin letting her cat inside. She waved and I waved back, pretending everything was fine. Pretending I wasn't standing in the middle of the biggest betrayal of my life. Inside, through the kitchen window, I could see my parents still sitting at the table, their heads bent together, whispering. They thought they were in control. But they had no idea what was coming. "Sign it," he said, his voice low, sharp enough to cut. I stood there, staring at the papers in his hand, the air heavy between us. My fingers twitched at my sides, but I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't move at all. Instead, I tilted my head slightly and gave him a look that I knew he wouldn't understand. A look that said I was already 5 steps ahead. "Tomorrow's Sunday," I said softly. "You wouldn't want a scene before church, would you?" That stopped him. Just for a moment. His jaw clenched and he pulled the papers back to his chest like a gambler folding bad cards. He didn't answer, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The next morning the church bells rang just like they always did. The old stone building stood tall against the pale autumn sky, its windows catching the light, the smell of wet leaves clinging to the air. I walked in with them, sat in the pews with them, and smiled like everything was normal. But it wasn't normal. Not anymore. My parents moved through the crowd like they owned the place. My mother greeted people with warm hugs, her perfume lingering in the air like roses overwrought. My father shook hands firmly, his laugh too loud, too rehearsed. When the time came, they stood at the front, smiling as if nothing weighed on them. And then my mother, with a voice sweet enough to hide poison, said, "We've been blessed with a new beginning. A dream. A vision for our family." The congregation clapped. Heads nodded. A few whispered, "Amen." I sat still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my smile thin and fixed. Inside my stomach turned. Because every word they spoke was built on my name. After the service, while people lingered in the fellowship hall with coffee and cookies, I listened to the way my parents boasted. "It's all coming together," my father said to Mr. Jenkins, puffing up his chest. "We couldn't have done it without her," my mother added, placing a hand on my shoulder like I was a prize calf at auction. Her touch burned, but I didn't flinch. I just smiled. Quite steady. Mr. Jenkins beamed. "That's wonderful. You must be so proud of your daughter." Proud. The word made me want to laugh. They weren't proud. They were greedy. And worse, they thought I was too soft, too compliant, too old-fashioned to push back. That evening back at the house the mood was different. The performance was over. The smiles slipped off their faces like masks dropped on a stage floor. My mother tossed her coat onto a chair and sighed. "It went well," she said, more to herself than to me. My father grunted, loosening his tie. "It'll be fine. Just fine." I stayed quiet, watching them move around the kitchen like restless animals. That was when I noticed it, the pile of papers on the counter. Loan documents, brochures, receipts. Carelessly left out as if I were blind. I drifted closer, careful not to draw attention. My eyes scanned the pages. Interest rates, signatures, notes in my mother's handwriting. My name circled in blue ink, underlined twice. They had been planning this for longer than I realized. Later that night, when the house finally grew quiet, I slipped into the kitchen. The clock read just after midnight. I could hear my father's snoring down the hall, my mother's faint cough between breaths. I opened a drawer and pulled out my small black notebook. Its cover was worn, the pages filled with months of quiet observations. Receipts I'd copied, conversations I'd jotted down, suspicious phone calls I'd overheard. Now I added more. Dates. Numbers. Exact wording from the papers I'd seen. Slowly, methodically, I recorded it all. Each line felt like stitching another thread into a net they didn't know I was weaving. When I closed the notebook, I held it against my chest for a moment, breathing steady. It felt heavy. Powerful. Like a weapon disguised as ink and paper. The next week I started noticing cracks. A phone call cut short when I walked into the room. A whispered argument behind a closed door. The way my mother snapped at my father one morning, her voice sharp and tight. "You promised it would be simple." Simple. Nothing about this was simple. One evening I accidentally left the mail on the kitchen table instead of sorting it. A bank envelope sat on top. I watched my father's face tighten as he grabbed it, his eyes flicking toward me. "Curious?" he asked, forcing a laugh. I smiled sweetly. "Should I be?" He didn't answer. He just shoved the envelope into his jacket pocket and walked out. At church, though, the act continued. They spoke of blessings and faith, their voices full of confidence. But I noticed the way some people began to ask questions. "Big plans you've got there," Mrs. Larkin said one Sunday, her brows raised. "Hope it all works out." Her tone wasn't admiration. It was curiosity edged with doubt. I caught the look my parents exchanged, quick, nervous, almost imperceptible. And I knew the mask was beginning to slip. Back home I became quieter. Not withdrawn, not sulking, just still. Watching. Listening. When my mother left her purse on the counter, I glanced inside and found a folded note. A reminder to call the bank first thing Monday. When my father stepped outside to smoke, I noticed how long he stayed on the phone, pacing the yard with his back turned. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Their dream wasn't just fragile, it was already cracking. One night I decided to test them. At dinner, while my mother stirred her stew and my father read the paper, I asked casually, "So, how's the loan coming along?" The spoon clattered against the pot. My father lowered the paper, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you asking?" he said. I shrugged. "Just curious. You keep saying it's for all of us." My mother forced a laugh. "Oh, don't worry about that. We've got everything under control." Under control. They said it too quickly, too defensively. And that was when I knew they were starting to feel me watching. That night I wrote in my notebook again. This time I didn't just jot down facts. I wrote my thoughts, my suspicions, my plans. The pen scratched across the page, steady and deliberate. Each word was another brick in the wall I was building around them. When I set the notebook down, I felt a strange calm. I didn't need to argue, didn't need to scream. All I had to do was wait. Because eventually their lies would collapse under their own weight. And when that happened, I would be ready. The days moved on, ordinary on the surface but charged underneath. Every sound in the house, the ring of the phone, the shuffle of papers, the slam of a door, carried more meaning now. One evening as I was folding laundry, I overheard them in the next room. "We need her to sign," my father hissed. "She will," my mother whispered back. "She has to." I held the towel in my hands, folding it neatly, my face calm. Inside, though, my chest tightened with something between fury and determination. They still believed they had me trapped. They had no idea how far I'd already stepped out of their reach. That Sunday back at church, the performance continued. But this time as I sat in the pews, I noticed something new. A few people whispered, not with admiration but suspicion. A sideways glance here, a raised brow there. The tide was shifting. And I sat there quietly, my hands folded in my lap, smiling just enough to keep the mask in place. Because I knew, the cracks in their dream were only going to grow. And I intended to be there when it all fell apart. That thought stayed with me the following week, humming under my skin like a secret tune only I could hear. Outwardly, life moved along. Dinners at the table, errands run, the usual Sunday services. But beneath it all, I began noticing the changes. Small ones at first, almost invisible to anyone else but clear to me. My father, once so loud and confident, had grown quieter in the evenings. He sat in his chair with the newspaper open but rarely turned a page. My mother, who normally filled the kitchen with chatter, now hummed nervously while she cooked, the sound thin and restless. The cracks were there, faint but spreading. And I kept watching. One Tuesday morning the first bill arrived. It came tucked in with the usual mail, grocery flyers, a catalog, an envelope from the electric company. But this one was different. Thick, official-looking with the bank's logo stamped across the top. I placed it on the counter right in the open and waited. That evening when my father came home, I saw the way his eyes locked on it immediately. He picked it up fast, too fast, and slid it under a stack of newspapers. But not before I noticed the tightness in his jaw, the quick flare of his nostrils. "What's that?" I asked, pretending to be casual as I stirred the soup on the stove. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said too quickly. And there it was, the first real crack, jagged and sharp. The next day brought another sign. I came into the kitchen to find my mother on the phone, her voice hushed, hand cupped over the receiver. "Yes, I understand. But we just need a little more time," she whispered. "It's not what you think, it's just a temporary setback." When she saw me standing there, she ended the call abruptly, forcing a smile. "Wrong number," she said. I didn't challenge her. I just nodded and went about my business. But inside I felt a quiet surge of power. They were scrambling now, fumbling to keep control. And they had no idea how closely I was paying attention. By Friday their arguments had started. Small ones at first, little barbs tossed across the kitchen like careless darts. "You should have planned better," my mother snapped one evening as she chopped onions, her hands shaking. "And you should have kept quiet," my father shot back, slamming the fridge door harder than necessary. I sat at the table, sipping tea, saying nothing. The steam curled up from my cup, blurring my view of them just slightly, like watching a play through a fogged window. They had no idea that every word, every fight, every slip of the tongue was another note in my black notebook. That Sunday at church, the difference was noticeable. The applause they'd once received had quieted. Whispers floated at the edges of the congregation, subtle but unmistakable. "Didn't they say it was all set?" I overheard one woman murmur to another. "I heard they might have borrowed more than they can handle," came the reply. I kept my head bowed, hands folded, face calm. But inside my heart pounded. The cracks were widening in public now. The dream they'd paraded so proudly was beginning to sour in the very place they thought was safest. That afternoon back at home I found something new. A letter half buried in the trash beneath potato peels and coffee grounds. I pulled it out carefully, brushing it off with a paper towel. It was from the bank. A notice. Words like past due and immediate attention required glared up at me. My breath caught for a moment, then steadied. I folded it neatly and slipped it into my notebook. Another piece of the puzzle. Another thread in the net. When my father came into the kitchen later, I offered him a smile. "Dinner will be ready soon," I said softly, as though nothing had changed. But everything had. Over the next week the house grew heavier. My mother cleaned obsessively, wiping counters that were already spotless, as if scrubbing could erase the growing tension. My father spent longer hours away, claiming extra work, but returning with tired eyes and clenched fists. At night I lay awake listening. The muffled arguments. The pacing footsteps. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor at 2 a.m. Each sound was another reminder. The dream was cracking and soon it would shatter. One evening I decided to test them again. As my mother set plates on the table, I asked casually, "So, when will I get to see this new house you've been talking about?" She froze just for a second, then forced a laugh. "Oh, not yet. It's still early. Lots of paperwork to get through." My father's fork scraped harshly against his plate. "Don't ask questions you don't need answers to," he muttered. I leaned back, folding my arms. Funny. You've told everyone else about it. Seems strange I'd be the only one in the dark. His eyes flashed, sharp and dangerous, but I held his gaze steadily. For a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the kitchen clock, loud and relentless. And then my mother changed the subject, her voice too bright, too forced. But the damage was done. The air was different now. Heavier. The next day I made a discovery that shifted everything. While my mother was out hanging laundry and my father napped in his chair, I slipped into their room. On the desk, tucked beneath a pile of envelopes, was a folder. Inside, I found copies of the loan agreement, with my name scrawled across the bottom in a signature that wasn't mine. The following week, their arguments grew louder. You said it would be simple, my mother shouted one night, her voice cracking. And you said she'd never fight back, my father roared. I sat in my room, the notebook open on my lap, listening to every word. My pulse was steady, my breath calm. Because for the first time I realized something. They weren't just cracking under the weight of the loan. They were cracking under the weight of me, my silence, my calm, my refusal to break. I had become the ghost in the house. Quiet, watching, impossible to ignore. The breaking point came one rainy Thursday evening. The storm outside rattled the windows, the smell of wet earth drifting in through the cracks. I walked into the living room to find my father pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. No, listen, we'll figure it out. Just give us another month. Another pause. His shoulders slumped. Yes. I know it's past due. When he hung up, he saw me standing there. His face hardened. Don't look at me like that. I raised my eyebrows. Like what? Like you know something, he snapped. I smiled faintly. Maybe I do. His mouth opened as if to argue, but then he closed it again. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't want to know. And that silence told me everything. By the end of the week, the cracks were no longer subtle. They were wide, gaping, impossible to hide. My parents avoided each other, avoided me, avoided even their friends at church. The house that had once been filled with chatter now felt like a fragile shell, trembling under the weight of secrets. And I sat in the middle of it all, calm and patient, notebook in hand. Because I knew, this was only the beginning. And when the dream finally collapsed, I would be there to watch it fall. I didn't expect the first knock so soon. It was a Thursday evening, the kind of damp, chilly night where the air feels heavy even indoors. The storm had passed hours earlier, but the smell of rain still clung to the ground. I was folding laundry at the dining room table when I heard it. 3 sharp raps against the front door. Not a neighborly tap. Not the easy knock of a friend. This was firm. Visual. My father froze in his chair, the newspaper slipping from his hands. My mother stiffened, her spoon clattering against the pot on the stove. Another knock followed, louder this time. My heart quickened, but not with fear. With recognition. The wolves had arrived. My father rose slowly, his chair scraping across the floor. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at my mother. He just walked to the door and cracked it open. Yes. His voice was rough, forced, casual. Mr. Ellis? The voice was calm, firm. A man's voice. We're here about the loan. My father stepped outside quickly, pulling the door behind him. But I stayed where I was, ears sharp. Through the thin wood I caught fragments. Payment overdue. Can't delay. Final notice. My mother's hands shook as she stirred, the metal spoon clanging against the pot. Her lips pressed thin, her face pale. I folded another towel, slowly, deliberately. The wolves were circling now, and I wasn't going to miss a sound. When he came back inside 10 minutes later, his face was drained of color. He didn't say a word. He tossed the folded notice onto the counter, grabbed his coat and left without explanation. The slam of the door rattled the dishes in the cupboard. I walked over to the counter. My mother moved to stop me, but I was quicker. I picked up the notice. Words in bold letters stared back at me. Final demand. Failure to respond may result in legal action. I laid the paper back down neatly and looked at her. Everything under control? I asked softly. Her lips trembled. She didn't answer. The next days were a blur of tension. Phone calls came more often now, sometimes answered, sometimes ignored. Each time the phone rang, my father's shoulders tightened, my mother's face went pale. Once I picked it up before they could. Hello. Silence, then a clipped reply. This is regarding the Ellis account. May I speak to? Before I could finish, my father snatched the phone from my hand, his face blazing red. He barked something I couldn't hear, then slammed the receiver down. "Don't answer calls that aren't for you," he snapped. I smiled faintly. "Funny. They sound like they're for me." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. By Sunday, the whispers at church had sharpened. I caught Mrs. Larkin again near the coffee table, speaking in a low voice to another woman. "They were bragging just weeks ago," she said. "Tao, look at them," the other replied. I walked past them, keeping my face calm, but my heart beat steady with a strange satisfaction. Their stage was crumbling. The smiles, the boasting, it all sounded hollow now, even to those who had once cheered them on. During the service, I watched my parents closely. My mother's smile was too bright, stretched thin like glass about to crack. My father didn't look up once, his head bowed low, hands gripping the hymnal so tight his knuckles turned white. The wolves weren't just at the door anymore. They were inside the sanctuary, in the eyes of the congregation, in the whispers that buzzed like bees. Back home, their arguments turned sharp. "You should have stopped while we had the chance," my mother hissed one night. "And let her mock us? Let everyone think we failed," my father shot back. I sat in my room, the notebook open on my lap, writing it all down. The sound of their voices carried down the hallway like echoes in a cave. I paused, tapping the pen against the page, and thought, they weren't afraid of the loan itself. They were afraid of losing face. Afraid of the gossip. Afraid of being seen for what they truly were. That fear was stronger than any bill. The second knock came on a Tuesday morning. This time it wasn't just collectors. I was in the kitchen when two uniformed men walked up the driveway. They weren't in a hurry. They moved with the steady confidence of people who knew they'd be listened to. My mother peeked through the curtains, her face going pale. "Don't answer," she whispered. But my father did. He opened the door, forced a smile, and tried to block their view. I stood in the kitchen doorway, close enough to hear. "Need to confirm identity. Further investigation. Co-signed in her name." Their eyes flicked to me standing in the shadows. For the briefest second, silence filled the space. Then my father stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him once again. I stayed still, my heart pounding. They knew. They knew my name was on it. The wolves had finally sniffed out the truth. When he came back inside, sweat dampened his collar. His face was tight, his movements stiff. He avoided my gaze completely. My mother cornered him in the kitchen. "What did they say?" she demanded. "Nothing. Just procedure," he muttered. But I knew better. I could feel the shift like the air before a storm. This wasn't just about missed payments anymore. This was about exposure. And exposure was the one thing they couldn't survive. The days that followed felt heavier. The phone rang at odd hours. Envelopes arrived daily, stamped with words like urgent and final notice. One night, I walked into the living room to find my father sitting in the dark, the unopened mail spread across the coffee table. He didn't notice me at first. His head was in his hands, his shoulders slumped. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine. There was no anger this time. Just defeat. "You don't understand," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse, almost pleading. "We did this for the family." I tilted my head, studying him. "For the family, or for yourselves?" He flinched but didn't answer. My mother tried to hold on longer. She cleaned, baked, fussed over every detail as though appearances could patch the holes. But her eyes gave her away. Red-rimmed, tired, darting constantly toward the phone, the window, the mailbox. One afternoon, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, a church bulletin in front of her. She was writing notes in the margins. Names, numbers, reminders. "What's that?" I asked. She looked up quickly, covering the paper with her hand. "Nothing important." But I caught the corner of a word before she hit it. Donation. She was planning her own defense. Reaching out for sympathy, for cover. I walked away without another word, but the image stayed with me. The third knock came at night. This time it wasn't polite. It was heavy. Relentless. The kind of knock that carries authority. My father jumped up, his face pale. My mother froze, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I sat still, my breath steady, heart thudding in my chest. When he opened the door, two officers stood there. "Come. Professional. Firm. Mr. and Mrs. Ellis?" one asked. My mother gasped. My father stammered. But the words that followed were clear. "We need you both to come with us." The scene unfolded slowly, like a play I'd been rehearsing in my head for months. My parents, once so smug and untouchable, were let out the front door. Their neighbors peeked through curtains. Porch lights flicked on down the street. I stood in the hallway watching quietly. As they passed me, my mother's eyes met mine. There was no smile now, no mask. Only fear. "Say something," she whispered desperately. But I didn't. I just held her gaze, calm and steady, until she looked away. When the door closed and the house fell silent, I stood in the middle of the living room, breathing in the stillness. The wolves had come. And they had taken what was theirs. But even as the night settled around me, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because revenge isn't finished when the wolves come knocking. It's finished when the silence that follows belongs only to you. But my revenge wasn't finished. Not yet. The law had done its part. It had dragged them out under the streetlights, past the stares of neighbors, past the whispers that would grow into rumors by morning. That was justice in the eyes of the world. But I wasn't after justice. I wanted something deeper. Something they could feel long after the prison gates closed. I wanted their pride. The next day I pulled out my black notebook and spread it open on the kitchen table. Page after page stared back at me. Dates, signatures, forged documents, overheard calls. My months of silence had turned into a record of everything they had tried to bury. Now it was time to use it. I started with the church. I sat at my desk and wrote letters. Short, polite, factual. I included copies of the documents they had signed in my name, each page neatly highlighted, each forgery impossible to deny. I slipped them into envelopes and mailed them to the pastor, the deacons, the very people my parents had tried to impress. By Sunday, their names weren't spoken in admiration anymore. They were whispered in shame. But I didn't stop there. I printed flyers. Plain, simple, nothing dramatic. Just the truth. John and Margaret Ellis charged with fraud. Loan taken in daughter's name without consent. I left them in mailboxes at the library bulletin board, even slid one under the door of the hair salon where my mother used to brag about her vision. Every place where they had built their reputation, I placed a crack in the foundation. I could have stopped with the law. I could have stopped with the whispers. But stopping would have meant they got to keep something. Their image, their dignity, their power over how others remembered them. And I wasn't about to give them that. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the prison. The handwriting was my mother's. Small, neat, the way she used to write grocery lists. "We made mistakes. We're still your parents. Don't abandon us." I folded the letter once, twice, then slid it back into the envelope. I didn't reply. Another came from my father, harsher, demanding. "You're ungrateful. You think you've won, but you'll regret this." That one I burned. I watched the flames curl around the edges, the smoke twisting upward until nothing was left but ash. Still, I wasn't finished. I remembered the bulletin my mother had scribbled on, the word donation scrawled in the margins. She had planned to beg for help, to twist sympathy into survival. So I wrote my own letters in their names. I imitated her handwriting perfectly. Years of watching her lists had trained my eye. Each letter asked for financial support during this difficult time, signed with their names. I mailed them across town. Money didn't come back, of course. But laughter did. Gossip. Snide remarks whispered in grocery aisles. The image of them begging for handouts spread faster than any sermon. Even behind bars, they couldn't escape it. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt quiet. I kept the notebook in a drawer, but I didn't need to write in it anymore. Its work was done. Instead, I began clearing the clutter they had left. Old bills, stacks of magazines, trinkets bought with money they never had. Piece by piece, I stripped the house of their presence until it felt like it belonged to me again. Some nights, I sat by the window with a cup of tea watching the street outside. Neighbors passed by, some glancing at the house, some avoiding it altogether. I could almost hear their thoughts. That's where it all happened. That's where the Ellis name fell apart. And I smiled. Months passed. My parents wrote again, softer this time. They begged. They promised. They tried to shift blame. But I had no intention of answering. They had taken my name and tried to chain me to their dream. I had taken theirs and turned it into a cautionary tale. It wasn't rage that kept me from replying. It was peace. Silence was my revenge now. The kind they couldn't shout down, couldn't argue with, couldn't rewrite. The final letter came a year later. My mother's handwriting again, shakier this time. "We're getting older. We just want to hear your voice. Even if you can't forgive us, please don't let us die alone. I read it slowly, then folded it back into the envelope. I placed it in the drawer with the notebook and closed it without hesitation. Because forgiveness was never part of my plan. One Sunday morning I walked into church alone. The whispers had long since faded, replaced by nods of quiet respect. Some looked at me with pity, others with admiration, but no one looked at me as a victim. I sat in the pew, hands folded, and listened to the sermon. The pastor spoke of honesty, of integrity, of the cost of lies. His words rang louder for me than anyone else. When the service ended, Mrs. Larkin stopped me at the door. "You've been strong," she said softly. "Stronger than most would have been." I smiled politely. But inside I thought, strength wasn't the secret. Patience was. Patience and silence. At night when I lay in bed, I sometimes thought of that evening at the kitchen table, the papers pushed toward me, the pen waiting. I remembered the smug smiles, the certainty in their voices. And then I thought of the knock at the door, the officers' calm voices, the way their pride shattered under the weight of reality. Those two memories sat side by side in my mind like bookends. One marked the beginning of their dream. The other marked the end. And between them, my silence had filled the pages. Now the house is quiet. The phone no longer rings with demands. The kitchen clock ticks softly, steady, no longer a countdown to betrayal. Sometimes I open the drawer and glance at the notebook, the letters, the ashes of what they tried to build. And I feel nothing but calm. Because in the end, revenge wasn't about screaming or fighting or proving a point. It was about taking back what was mine. My name. My voice. My life. The law had punished them. The world had mocked them. But my silence, my deliberate, patient silence, had buried them deeper than any sentence. And that was the sweetest revenge of all. They sold my name for their dream, but I turned their dream into their curse. And I never had to raise my voice to do it. If this story gripped you, subscribe now for more powerful revenge stories where silence, strength, and justice collide. Your next favorite story is waiting.